We continue with perspectives, and our focus today will be God's presence. This is part 2 of perspectives. And today we read from the book of Exodus, chapter 14, verse 15 to 31. It's a long passage, and I'll try to read it fast. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Verse 19. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from it in front and stood behind them, coming in between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near or other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on the dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and the cloud. Egyptians' army and threw it into confusion. Wheels of their chariots so that they had difficult driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and the chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, and the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Verse 29. But the Israelites went through the dry sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. When the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, they feared the Lord and put their trust in him and Moses, his servant. Just a quick introduction. Last week we learned about perspective on God's process. And we say that when our perspective misaligns who God actually is and how he does things, our journey with him can get rough. And we focused on understanding God's process. And this week we are going to learn about having the right perspective when it comes to God's presence. Since this passage, having a conversation with the Lord. And the Lord speaks to Moses and tells him, tell the Israelites to move on. Remember, the Israelites were crying to Moses because they were terrified. They could see the Egyptians following them, and ahead of them was a Red Sea. So when they cried to Moses, God tells them, tell them to move on. I mean, how are they supposed to move on when there is a sea ahead of them? He doesn't tell them to flee. He doesn't tell them to run away. He tells them, move on. God said to Moses that. Why does he tell them to move on? Because his presence was with them. Remember, is everything to Israel. When they leave the place that they had stayed under slavery, they did not leave with weapons. Clothes to last them for 40 years in wilderness, or food or water. God was everything to them. And that's why Moses later in chapter 33 of Exodus and verse 16 says, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up there, because the presence of God was everything for them. Very much, I have a question for you today. Do you regard God's presence in your life as a treasure? Is God everything to you? As I suggest that we need to remind ourselves every moment about the priceless value we have in knowing God and having a relationship with Him. We need to treasure God's presence in our life. And why? Because God's presence protects us, and God's presence gives us victory. God's presence protects us. When you read from verse 19 to 20 and then 24 to 25. God, who had been traveling in front of Israelites' army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved in front and stood behind them, coming in between the armies of Israel. Those verses 24 to 25, you realize that it is priceless to know God. He protects us and fights our invisible and visible fights. God fought for Israel on that night while they were walking on the Red Sea and being followed by Egyptians. And there are multiple ways God did that. He ensured a reasonable gap between both Israel and their enemies. When you read verse 19, when you get time, I encourage you to read that passage slowly. The other way that God fought for Israelites was He regulated the light and darkness between both camps. God fought for Israelites was He threw confusion into the Egyptian army. When you read from verse 24. And when you read verse 25, He jammed the wheels of the Egyptians so that they had difficult driving. Towards the Egyptians was so bad that they even detected. They got afraid and confessed it. Verse 25 says, the Egyptians said, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Things are happening. Israel may not have noticed God was doing something. They may not have felt that God was intervening for them. They probably didn't feel any difference as they walked all night hearing the commotion of the chariots following them, or maybe seeing them coming from a distance. I always try to imagine how they felt walking all night. Maybe intense emotions, maybe fear, maybe disappointment, maybe not knowing what to expect the next minute. Fought for them in big and in small ways that they may never have noticed during the storm. I want to say that during a trying moment, it is easy to focus on everything that is going wrong and miss the little things that God is doing to remind us about His presence. Secure in the arms of God in these turbulent times we are living in. With recession, gas prices, post-COVID struggles, shall we trust God's reassuring presence, or shall we get carried away by the wave of desperation? Present even when we don't feel. God is present even when we don't see. And says that if all you see is what you see, you will never see all that there is to be seen. Is what you see. You'll never see all that is there to be seen. Dr. Tony Evans says that. God calls us to trust Him and to walk by faith. What we see with our physical eyes may be misleading. How we feel could be misleading. We can trust His love for us. We can trust what He promises as true. Him as a God who never lies or fails. God's presence, even in difficult times, is with us and for us. He fights for us in ways that we may never see. Trying time and you feel like God has abandoned you, His children, not be a reflection of what is really happening. Are you stuck in a crisis and you feel like you're drowning? I encourage you to look for the victories that the Lord has around you. There are small victories that you can miss, but they are there that God uses to reassure you and me that He is present. His presence is there for us. God's presence. God's presence gives us victory. Verse 29 to 31. You know the chariots and horsemen of Pharaoh were very well equipped to win. Israelites had no weapon. All they had was God. Looking at both teams, it is intimidating because their opponents were equipped and them they did not have any weapon. Look at both, and when you are on the side of Israelites, feel like the option of winning is not there. You can have the best and most powerful weapons and still lose the battle. Yes, it's a possibility. Proverbs 21:31 says, the horse is prepared for the day of battle, but deliverance and victory belongs to the Lord. The battle without a weapon on their hand because they had God on their side. Verse 30 says, that day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of Egyptians. When we walk with the Lord in obedience, His presence gives victory even when we are not equipped or qualified. Not to undermine the importance of preparation or excellence, but these alone do not guarantee victory. God's presence is important for victory. God's presence is powerful and can do what we can never imagine. Position and you doubt your qualifications or experience can earn you that job. A hope before trying. Pray and give it a shot. Project or plan that you have set before the Lord and it looks too big for your financial status. Do not be discouraged. Our God is a mountain mover. We know God's presence is powerful, but we get overwhelmed by hardships and forget. I challenge all of us to cultivate a good habit of memorizing verses so that when you feel defeated, you can refer to them and you can recite them and you can remind yourself. I encourage you to keep trusting that when you have God's presence, you have victory on your side. When you have God's presence, you are sufficient. You have all you need. Whether seasons change, whether seasons remain the same, our God does not change. He is faithful. He will carry us through in any circumstance, in every season, and He is faithful to guard and protect us. When we have God's presence, we have protection. When we have God's presence, we have victory.